Guns. Destruction, magic, weapons are some of the most important design elements of any game that features any kind of combat. In games where the main gameplay is attacking other things, the tools you have to attack the other things, which is what I mean by weapons, be them guns, swords, other entities you control, or your fists, these are your interaction tools, and they make or break the gameplay, and like everything else, they're near impossible to get perfect. Because of this, player attacks are some of the most tampered with game elements. Damage numbers, attack speed, new guns all being rebalanced, overhauled, tweaked ad nauseum until the game just dies or the developers give up. They're also the subject of great scrutiny within any game's community, and I thought a video about weapon design would be fun, so here we are. The aim of this video is to explain the principles of weapon design and then use examples of bad weapon design to demonstrate why those principles exist. Now, I spent 4 weeks in the think tank and another 2 just knee deep in shitty opinions forging the script for this video, so I hope it was worth it. And I should also probably get out of this pool of shit, huh? Now, I know context is lame, but you gotta slog through it with me. So the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the word weapons is like guns and shit, and that is mostly what I'm going to be talking about. But a weapon in this context is just the player's method of attack, whatever that may be. Like I said in the intro, that could be like other entities in an RTS game or your fists in a fighting game. It's just worth noting that a weapon is just the player's method of attack. However, in this video, because it is my video, we're mostly just going to be talking about competitive multiplayer games. And when I say games, I mostly mean shooters. I like talking about shooters, so that's mostly what this video is going to be about. But not just any shooters, competitive shooters. So like PvP as opposed to PvE. Now, I have to say this before the Deep Rock Galactic and Doom Eternal people get mad at me. Yes, most of the weapon design ideas and conventions I talk about will still apply to multiplayer and single player PvE. And co-op and single-player PvE games can feature multiplayer game modes where actual players take control of the enemies, but outside of that, primarily PvE games design their weaponry differently. In single-player and PvE games, the enemies are AI. In multiplayer games, the enemies are people. In single-player and PvE games, you only have to craft the experience around one party, often just the single player. The weapons are designed only with the enjoyment of the player using them in mind, and the incoming attacks are designed only with how it feels to be on the receiving end of them in mind. The balance can be changed at the start of a mission or in the settings menu by the players at any time. Now, this does not mean that balance and design are easier in these games, nor does it mean that skill, fun, and actual balance are just non-factors in these games. It simply means that they are crafting a different experience, and one where the weapon design is different from multiplayer. Alright, now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, let's actually get going here. You see that? You see how the lights turned on when I snapped my fingers? That was pretty cool, eh? Fucking, yeah, not bad, eh?
He's nice.
Okay, so that was enough context. Now let's get into the real meat and potatoes of the video here. This is the main idea of the video. So there are 3 main principles of weapon design. You got your balance, you got your skill, and you got your fun. Now, these principles are mostly self-explanatory, but I still want to take a second to be as unambiguous as I can. And I'll start by explaining what I mean by By balance, I mean nothing more or less than the competitive effectiveness of a weapon when balanced against the other weapons in a game. The raw statistics taken at face value and compared against the other weapons in the same game. The raw damage numbers, the time to kill, the price, just the viability of a weapon in a game's ecosystem. For example, a very unbalanced weapon could be so good it's considered a must pick, or maybe it's a weapon that is just so dog shit that it is given less thought than a middle child. Because of the amount of factors, both common and game specific, that contribute to the balance of a weapon, identifying a universal sweet spot is impossible. But as long as it's at least situationally usable and or not game breaking, it's probably fine. The competitive balance is a great place to start when dissecting a weapon, and you could be forgiven for thinking that it's the only thing that matters. It's not, but if you think that way, that's fine, and hey, you can start making TF2 weapon analysis videos. But it's still only one of 3 pillars that holds up weapon design. When we talk about skill, there's 2 parts and then there's 2 sides to each part. There's the skill of the player using the weapon, and then there's the skill of the enemy gamer that has to fight the player using the weapon. And then for both the user and the enemy, there's the skill floor. This is the lowest amount of skill needed to effectively use or counter a weapon. And then there's the skill ceiling. This is the highest amount of skill you can achieve using a weapon's mechanics or fighting the weapon's mechanics. The higher the skill ceiling, the more room for improvement there is, and the better the weapon is considered from a skill perspective. Obviously, the skill floor and ceiling of the player using the weapon are more important, but you really can't forget about the counterplay. Good games with good weapon design often encourage skillful player interactions based off the weapon choice of the players. A good example of these ideas is, ironically, the flamethrower from TF2. It's always had the lowest skill floor out of every weapon in the game. I'm honestly pretty confident that my cat could figure out how to kill someone with it, and she's dumb for cat standards. But at release in 2007, it had a very low skill ceiling as well. I mean, there's only so much you can do with a flamethrower, right? So Valve adds Air Blast, a mechanic that pushes enemies away and, when timed correctly, reflects incoming projectiles at the cost of 10% of your ammo reserve. This not only helped balance the pyro class in general, but also drastically increased the skill ceiling for the flamethrower. It also made player interactions far more interesting and increased the skill floor of the players looking to fight a competent pyro player using the flamethrower. Again, it still has the lowest skill floor, but this is just beautiful game design, especially for the time. So I realize it's impossible to talk about fun in like anything nowadays without the might of 1,000 keyboard warriors thundering upon you, talking about how it's all subjective, and actually they really like shoving toothpicks up their asses or some fucking shit like that, and they have a point, not about the toothpick thing, but about subjectivity. Because it's obviously impossible to quantify and compare the fun value of every weapon in every game. Some weapons are intentionally clunky, while others are snappy and tactile. So sound design, silliness, and how effective a weapon is will do a lot of heavy lifting for a weapon's fun score. But again, not everyone likes the same thing. Which is why the uniqueness of a weapon is also what I mean by fun, not just how it feels to use, throw, or shoot. So how interesting a gun is also gets it points here, even if not everyone thinks this newfangled gun is the funnest thing to use. To keep using the flamethrower as an example, there are lots of different flamethrower unlocks that are pretty much the same, but there's one, the Dragon's Fury, which is drastically different. So even though I personally hate using it, it gets a good fun score because it scratches the back of a lot of previously unfulfilled pyro gamers. And like skill, fun also applies to the enemy gamers. A really well-designed weapon isn't just fun to shoot, but also fun to get shot at with, or at least like not super annoying to get shot at with. Sniper rifles, for example, are notoriously fun to shoot and very not fun to get shot at with. I made an entire video about how they are just not fun weapons. They suck. Anyway, let's just move on. There's no need to work myself up. Let's just go on a quick tangent from the fun thing, which is weapon modding. Weapon modding is a common mechanic, and it's a great way for players to tailor their weapons exactly the way they like them. This immediately helps with the fun factor, since players can just do what they think is fun with weapons they think are fun. Weapon mods add a balance element to the game, and they also reward players for using certain guns. Weapon modding is cool, but it is not implemented equally. Sometimes it's just something small and cute, like maybe you can add a little grip to a gun, or add a silencer, or change the scope, you know, something that just quickly helps whatever gun a player is using feel more personal to them. Or it can completely change the guns. My favorite example is in Tarkov, where Battlestate Games just threw the keys to the weapon design workshop at the players, like, fine, you can design your own fucking guns, asshole. We're just gonna tweak the bullets and some bases. Go fucking idiot. Anyway, so those are the 3 principles of weapon design. Every weapon in every game should be judged based off how competitively balanced it is, how skillful it is, and how fun it is. So with the 3 design principles in our back pocket, let's look at some weapons that get it all wrong, starting with the reason I'm making this video. The Natascha is a pretty simple weapon in Team Fortress 2. It is a side grade to the minigun that takes a little longer to spin up and does a little less damage, but it slows enemies on hit and has a slight damage resistance when below half health and spun up. There are worse items in Team Fortress 2. There are items with poorer balance, there are items that are less fun to use and certainly less fun to fight, there are items that take less skill, and there are items with a lower skill ceiling. There are worse weapons in Team Fortress 2, but the Natascha I hate, because the Natascha represents everything I hate about bad weapon design. It is so similar to the stock minigun, yet every single change it makes is terrible, and it doesn't even look cool. Let me explain. So this is clearly a supportive side grade meant to be used with a good team that trades some damage and handling for a supportive effect, which is slowing down the enemy. But let's just go through this weapon's stats and mechanics. Slowing down enemies is a pretty shitty game mechanic even when it works. On the Natascha it's bugged, so you can cheese it by strafing left and right, but even players that know how to cheese it still have to run predictably, so the slowing effect shuts down enemy mobility. And in a game like TF2, where the dynamic mobility is a massive part of the appeal, this gun just spits in the face of all of that. It is a massive downgrade on the fun factor from the stock minigun for everyone. It also makes the skill ceiling lower. Tracking is literally easier when your enemies are being slowed down. It is a crutch and a counter to mobility. Fucking awesome game design, Valve. Which is a bummer, because support items can, emphasis on can, increase the skill ceiling involving team coordination and recognizing where and when to help the team. There is a little bit of that with the Natascha. I definitely noticed myself shooting more flying soldiers, but you're mostly still just shooting everyone? Anyway. The damage resistance is a stat that just escapes your mind faster than a cheater can escape Tarkov the second you load into a game. Don't get me wrong, it's still an upside and will be helpful, but it doesn't complement or go well with the rest of the gun. This is a last stand mechanic that exists on a support weapon. At first glance, you may assume a damage resistance stat on a tank character makes them better at absorbing incoming fire and staying at the front lines of a team fight longer. However, because of the fine print, this stat encourages you to stay in the line of fire and, importantly, not retreat into your team. And if you know anything about playing heavy in and around your team, you know that's not how you survive for longer than like 16 seconds. It'll help in that occasion every other game when you eat a crit sticky while revved up. Like, it's still an upside, it'll help you always. But most of the time, I only notice the resistance when I'm the last man standing, or I'm on my own and am backed into a corner where there's no healing and I have to fight to survive. I can't retreat, and that goes against the design philosophy of this weapon. The gun was changed so much that by the time the damage resistance stat was added, it had been 7 fucking years since the gun was added, and the original idea was just lost to time. Moving on, we have the damage penalty. What do you want me to say? There needed to be a trade-off for the slowing effect. Yeah, fuck it, let's just make it do less damage. Okay, being fair, a flat nerf to the damage output of a support weapon does make sense, and doesn't automatically make it not fun or anything. And if the support effect of this weapon was something other than just slowing enemy gamers, I wouldn't care, but as it is, this is just shitty as the user. I really noticed when getting clips for this video that I had to adjust my expectation for my damage output when spun up using this weapon. So even though the slowing effect is very powerful, and there were for sure some games where both teams were very skilled and the slowing effect had lots of impact on many engagements, I individually felt a lot weaker with this weapon, and it wasn't very fun for me subjectively. And lastly, we have the slower spin up time. Now in a Void, I think this is fine, since miniguns having different spin up times makes each of them feel a little more diverse in their playstyle. On this weapon though, because it makes it even less versatile, all it does is cement it as the team bitch minigun, especially when compared to the brass beast, another minigun side grade that does more damage at the cost of a slower spin up time. Honestly, a very similar weapon statistic wise, it's just like way more fun for everyone involved and is way fucking cooler. So that's the Natascha, an item that no one cares about because it's so similar to the stock minigun, but it's started to grind my gears more and more the more I think about it. And it honestly is the reason I made this video, because it just shits on good weapon design, which TF2 generally follows, and it makes the Natascha stick out like an erect dispenser. A support minigun concept is fun. The minigun is a devastating weapon, so converting that massive damage output into some support output is a great idea, but the implementation sucks. The slowing effect is objectively unfun for the enemy. The nerf to both handling and damage is unfun for the user because the slowing effect isn't enjoyable enough as a support effect. The slowing effect lowers both the skill floor and ceiling of the weapon, and this weapon is arguably too strong in a team setting, and is the only banned minigun in competitive sixes. For whatever that's worth, the weapon is still allowed in Highlander. If you use the Natascha, I fucking hate you. You're a genuine disgrace to heavy players, and you should genuinely feel bad for using such a gosh-awful weapon. Oh, my bad. I seem to have mispronounced Tomislav. My bad.
This is automation. Today's way of manufacturing.
The auto snipers are a pair of low recoil, high fire rate, semi-automatic sniper rifles in Counter-Strike 2 that can one-shot headshot or two-shot body shot enemy gamers. Now the economy of CS works on individual games, and at $5,000, the auto snipers are some of the most expensive guns in the entire game. And oftentimes the only way you can afford one is if you're already at a massive lead. But that isn't the main problem with the auto snipers. No, the main problem with these guns is the skill discrepancy. Because of the zoom, low recoil, and high body shot damage, these guns have not just an extremely low skill floor, but also an extremely low skill ceiling. Or at least as low as it takes to realize there's no practical justification at your skill level to keep shilling 5,000 for this thing. Some people insist on getting very good with this gun. See, because the weapons rely on a high fire rate and high body shot damage, skilled sniper players would rather opt for the AWP, which can one-shot body shot and is also cheaper. A skilled AWP player has the advantage over the skilled auto sniper player. And because high skilled rifle players don't need the scope and will one-shot headshot with their rifles anyway if they have an AK, that's the idea anyway. They'll spray and pray at closer ranges, which the auto snipers can't do, by the way. There's little reason to spend 5,000 on an auto sniper, so they aren't used often at higher skill levels, but at lower skill levels they become monsters because they're best at what they do, which is quickly body-shotting players to death at any distance. So there's a gentleman's agreement not to use these guns because below a certain skill threshold they are way too overpowered, and they are a crutch that prevents you from getting better at higher levels. Just think about that for 1 second. These guns are so shittily designed designed that depending on the skill of the lobby, they are either ignored in favor of better options or willfully abstained from for being too good. Now let's look at the three principles again. These guns are terribly balanced. They have a way too low skill floor for their power, they have a way too low skill ceiling to be taken seriously, and as for fun, well, you guys know how I feel about snipers, and if you watched my video, you would know how I feel about high fire rate snipers. Anyway, back to the auto snipers. They are some of the worst weapons in all of gaming. Now you can say whatever you want about Counter-Strike, that it's a snooze fest, it's boring, whatever, but you can't deny it is a very finely crafted game that's been reworked for over 2 decades. These guns just don't have a place in Counter-Strike, and I can almost guarantee they would be removed in the switch from Counter-Strike Go to Counter-Strike 2 if it weren't for the skin economy.
I got spurs that jingle, jangle, jingle,
Jingle jangle,
as I go riding merrily along.
jingle jangle.
And they sing, oh, ain't you glad you'll sing?
The Machete is a melee weapon in Hunt Showdown that I'm going to be picking on as a stand-in for 2 things: redundancy and melee weapon design in multiplayer shooter games. Melee design in shooters is odd. Nearly all shooters have some melee option, but their role is usually split into a few different functions, those being as a last resort option, as utility, or just as something silly. The last resort option is the first thing that comes to mind. In shooters, you often have ammo that you can run out of, in which case you need to resort to a melee weapon that doesn't require ammo. But even in games like Overwatch or whatever where you can't fully run out of ammo, you can use a melee attack as a last resort option in a scrappy looking fight or as a get off me tool. The single button melee attack is a pretty common, scrappy fight last resort option, and depending on the time to kill of the game it's in, it can often be a one-shot kill like in Titanfall or Call of Duty. But in games that have a specific melee weapon option, usually the main function is to whip it out as a last resort in scrappy fights, either because you ran out of ammo or just because it just got way too chaotic. But that isn't always the main function. Some sort of utility is the second most common function of melee weapons. And it's interesting because the utility of melee weapons is usually some general game mechanic that was offloaded onto the melee slot. For example, it's very common for you to be faster when you have your melee weapon out, so this turns it into a movement utility as well. Or for example, in Fortnite, the melee weapon also doubles as your harvesting tool. TF2 is also an obvious example where every class has tons of unlocks for their melee slot that all function as some sort of utility, oftentimes at the cost of their effectiveness at being an actual melee weapon. Anyway, the last function of melee items in games makes perhaps a little less sense from an outside perspective, but if you've played, any game, you know that melee weapons are silly. Being something that is silly is a very valid function and a very valid reason for something existing in a game. Killing someone with a knife in CSGO is almost always more difficult, but you do it because it's silly. And also money, but usually just because it's silly. In almost every game where melee items exist as their own weapons, it is seen as a funny event when you kill someone with one, even when they aren't even that bad at doing so, because these are shooters and you're using a fucking baseball bat or a frying pan instead of your gun. Okay, let's look back at Hunt Showdown. In Hunt Showdown, all melee serves a vital role with utility because they are going to be your primary way of dealing with the AI in the game. You don't want to use your guns because that is a waste of precious ammo, and also because they are very loud. And this is a game where gunshots are designed to be able to be heard from literally across the map. That's kind of the point. So you need a melee tool. That can be an actual melee tool in your tool slot or an attachment to your gun or as its own weapon. It should be obvious now that if you're taking a melee as its own weapon, you are sacrificing a sidearm and should expect more than the base utility you get out of the other melee options. And you are, because now all the specific melee weapons have the potential to one-shot kill with at least a heavy attack. So in those chaotic Hunt Showdowns where, you've missed every single shot, you can still come out on top. You're getting a little more out of that last resort function of melee weapons in the game because the utility function is already covered by all melee options. While making this video, the Machete in Hunt Showdown was actually buffed so that it now does one-shot kill with a heavy attack. Previously, that was not the case, and it made it effectively the same as any other melee tool in the tool slot. So, great work, Crytek. Here is your gold sticker. You've earned it. But wait, hold on, because I still want to talk about redundancy. Hunt Showdown is an extraction shooter with an individual economy for every player. You spend money on a loadout before entering a game. Because of that, there are many weapons that players consider just worse versions of X or better versions of X. But usually that either isn't true or isn't fair because of the in-game economy. And also, you don't always have access to all weapons because you need to unlock them first. So there's usually a reason for a gun existing, even if it's objectively worse than another when you just look at the guns on their own. However, the Machete is really bad. There are 6 melee weapons in the game, 3 light melees and 3 heavy melees. All have a basic attack and a strong attack, with the strong dealing more damage, swinging slower, and costing more stamina. The only practical difference between these 4 is the arc of the swing, which depending on the weapon will be easier or harder to hit with, the speed of the attacks, heavy melees are slower, and the damage type, which has minor gameplay implications. The rending damage type will cause bleeding, the intensity of which depends on the weapon and strength of the attack. And some AI are vulnerable or strong or react violently to certain damage types. These 2 are special in that they thrust, which has a longer range and adds another practical difference. That is all to say, these are pretty much interchangeable and all cost within $20 of each other except for the katana, which is an outlier and has its own special perk for a special attack. If you are going to take out a melee weapon, take a cavalry saber or katana with the dusters, or the baseball bat or hammer, so you can free up an extra tool slot. But honestly, the differences are negligible and they all do the same thing. Still, however, the Machete is the least versatile in exchange for costing the least. And they're all so cheap already, and now that they're all unlocked at rank 1, I honestly can't think of a single scenario where I'm intentionally taking the Machete. It'll get the job done, and it causes bleeding on the off chance you forget to take it off a free hunter and accidentally take it into the bayou. And like I said, it was buffed to do the bare minimum a melee weapon should do over the standard melee tool, so great work, Crytek. I understand that you want a shit melee weapon, but this is still an example of redundancy. So that's the Machete, a usable weapon, but a redundant one. At the very least, I can say the Machete, as well as every single melee weapon in Hunt Showdown, fulfills the silly function of melee weapons to a T. So there's that. Alright, that just about does it for examples. I had a lot more planned, scripted, and some recorded, but they didn't feel like they deserved entire segments, and it just artificially extended the video, so I'll just have this quick little honorable mentions section at the end here. The Mega Knight is a tanky, expensive card in the mobile strategy game Clash Royale. It slams the ground on placement, jumps from a distance for another slam, and has area damage. This card is arguably a bad card, but because it's fun and easy to use, unintuitive for casuals to counter, and because in Clash Royale the variance in the gameplay and balance between casual and pro matches is greater than almost all other competitive games, because not only does the average skill of the match change the balance and strategy, but also the very cards that are accessible and prevalent to players and the level of those cards changes, you see the Mega Knight far more than you should as the meta changes on your way up the ladder. And as a casual player, I can tell you that while a mini P.E.K.K.A. in my deck is all I need to counter this card, which by competitive standards is a bad card, it's still seen way too much. Looking at our principles of weapon design, we see that while the Mega Knight is balanced, fun, and about as skillful as other cards in some settings, because of the inconsistency in card availability, level, and skill of the latter, that cannot be said for all settings. And having this in mind when analyzing weapons in all games can be very useful in understanding a discrepancy in opinion among players of varying levels of experience. And makes the Mega Knight a great example for my video. The The SMG-08 is a very strong submachine gun in Battlefield 1. It has an extremely low time to kill, even by that game's standards, and has a very high ammo capacity, letting it melt through entire squads or even teams, with the trade-off being that it's harder to control than a natural disaster on Mars. There are servers that outright ban this gun. The sheer vitriol this weapon endures from the community is insane, despite it being near useless in certain scenarios, which makes the SMG-08 a great example of a weapon that is too situationally extreme for its own good. I understand that Pixel Gun 3D is an easy target, and I also understand this is an entire game and not a weapon, but I'm talking about it anyway because it is the best example I can think of a game that, when it comes to weapon design, does not give a single shit about anything other than how fun it is to shoot or slash or throw. This isn't just a game with bad balance or that takes no skill to use the weapons. This is a game that does not care at all. The amount of times where I turn a corner and just got absolutely beamed down by some spoiled brat in Washington or something, I swear this game does not care. There are guns that let you see through walls, locked behind a paywall, the whole works. There's no downsides to the paid weapons, it's just, it is what it is. And it's almost admirable. Almost. Weapon design is something that gets a lot of spotlight in gaming communities. People might talk about maps or game modes, but people talk a lot about each individual weapon in games. And understandably so, because like I said in the intro, they are your interaction tools. And hopefully this video was some interesting context to other weapon analyses by other people or even yourself when you're in game thinking this is really fucking stupid, which I know you will think, because we didn't just look at badly designed weapons, but we looked at why they're bad based off a universal criteria. And with that, I believe that's a wrap on this video. Now, of course, I didn't talk about every example of bad weapon design in video games, but I feel I've adequately articulated my analyses, and so this is where, instead of telling me that I missed something that's so obvious to you, you can be the one to tell me about it. I'll continue to try and read every comment, even if I don't respond, since you're putting in the effort to contribute to the conversation. The least I can do is read what you say. And you can also go down there and read a few comments, since judging by the fact that you just finished watching a short film length video about weapon design, you probably have some interest in the topic. Anywho, thank you all very much for watching to the end of the video. If you liked the video, you can like the video. If you want to subscribe to see more, you can do that too. My apologies for taking so long to finish this video. It was a bit of an undertaking while I had so many things going on in my life, but it all came together in the end and I'm pretty proud of the result. You can also let me know what you thought of it as well. I always seem to drag out my videos with this little off-the-cuff end speech I do after completing it fully. I'll refrain from keeping you here for too long though and just end it here. So goodbye, thank you for watching.